Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I'm Ken Meltzer, the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra's insider and program annotator. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the opening of our 2009-2010 Conversations of Note series. I see many familiar faces. Thank you for supporting this program in the past, and we look forward to a very exciting year with you this year as well. This conversation this evening focuses around two concerts that will take place this Thursday and Friday at Atlanta Symphony Hall. Music director Robert Spano leads a program that opens with the world premiere of Awakening from a Disappearing Garden, a work for solo, cello, narrator, and orchestra by the Asian-American composer Angel Lam. Yo-Yo Ma is the soloist in that world premiere. The second half of our program is an Atlanta Symphony Orchestra premiere. It is Igor Stravinsky's opera, The Nightingale. That concert will be repeated by all the performers at New York's Carnegie Hall on Saturday, November the 7th. We have a wonderful panel to discuss the upcoming concert and the issues surrounding it. And we also want to remind you that your questions are very much welcome as we proceed throughout this evening. Melanie Darby, the director of this series, has reminded me that there will be microphones available for you to ask your questions. And because this is being taped for future webcast, we'd ask you to please go ask your questions at the microphone so that they can be audibly recorded. I'll introduce my panel now. From my left, Dennis Hanthorn is the Zurich General Director of the Atlanta Opera. Prior to joining the Atlanta Opera in 2004, Dennis was General Director of the Florentine Opera Company in Milwaukee. Under Dennis's visionary leadership, the Atlanta Opera made its successful relocation to the Cobb Energy Performing Arts Center. This afternoon, the Atlanta Opera concluded the opening production of its 2009-2010 season, Gaetano Donizetti's The Elixir of Love. The remaining productions this season include Gluck's Orpheus and Eurydice, Verdi's Aida, and Mozart's The Magic Flute. And everyone on this stage joins Dennis in urging you to attend all of those performances throughout the remainder of the season.
Thank you, Ken.
Thank you, Dennis. Atlanta Symphony Orchestra Music Director Robert Spano was named Musical America's 2008 Conductor of the Year. This past summer, Robert returned to the Seattle Opera to conduct Richard Wagner's Ring Cycle. This coming spring, Robert Spano will begin a 3-year appointment as Distinguished Artist in Residence with Emory University. We're all very proud of Robert, and we thank him. Internationally acclaimed director James Alexander is a frequent and welcome collaborator with the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra. James has directed our productions of Bernstein on Broadway, Giacomo Puccini's La Boheme, both at Symphony Hall, and at the Verizon Wireless Amphitheater at Encore Park in Alpharetta. Last season, James Alexander directed our performances at Symphony Hall of Dr. Atomic by John Adams, and we are thrilled that James Alexander is back to direct Stravinsky's The Nightingale. So, welcome, James. Welcome to all of our panelists, and welcome to you once again.
Thank you.
Let's begin by talking about the physical structure of this production. This is part of our Theater of a Concert project, and it involves staging an opera on a symphony stage. I'd like to talk a little bit about the issues that are involved in performing an opera away from what we might consider the classic or traditional venue, and that is a large opera stage, and in this case on a symphony stage. So let's dive into that, if we may.
It's very easy for me. I just put the orchestra in the orchestra pit and put a set out there and hire the singers and produce it. But James, you have the most challenging concert stage of an opera.
I guess I like that challenge because I imagine that I have no budget. Well, actually, reality check, I have no budget. And I think sometimes one can make a silk purse out of a sow's ear. And I think what I do is I tend to listen to the score and recordings, read it, go back, as Ken would probably do, for note annotations, read the history of the composer's work, and then spend months looking up allegorical meaning. With the John Adams piece, I spent 300 hours researching the photographs which we put on slide. So it's a great privilege to work with such a Rolls Royce of an orchestra and be asked to come and play on their space. And this band, if I may call them that, love being involved in such projects. They want to be involved, they want to do things. So for me, it's about starting from scratch, literally starting from scratch, and imagining, what do I see when I hear this? And I saw a gold cloak, I saw a gold river. So you'll see a gold river, a gold cloak, and thinking how to keep this simple, very kabuki theater-like, simple, right down to 2 or 3 props. It's as simple as that.
You know, before we go any further in discussing how we're staging the Nightingale, it might be appropriate to just give a brief overview of the story based on a Hans Christian Andersen fairy tale.
Well, but if you don't mind, Ken, I want to step one back to the question you didn't ask yet.
Okay.
Which is why? Why would you do opera?
Right.
Because I'm often asked it. Why would you do opera instead of as an opera? What's the point of doing
And this
opera
is-
if you're not producing it?
This is your initiative, Robert. This Theater of a Concert is something that you originated with us some years back, so why? May I ask?
I find that there's a couple things that leap to mind as to why. One is the different perspective one gets on the work by experiencing it in a different way. In the same way that if one produces a work like the St. John Passion theatrically, we get a different perspective on it than if we did it simply in a concert format. I think we get a different perspective on a piece of the operatic repertoire when we put it into a different kind of focus by not experiencing it in its full-blown operatic presentation. And I find, and many people have said to me too, which I'm always grateful to hear, that they're hearing things differently, or that certain things about the score or the musical qualities come into a different kind of focus. I think the fact of having the orchestra visible and on stage immediately creates a different kind of experience, because the orchestra gets a greater focus than when it's in the pit. So I think there's just that having another lens with which to appreciate the work, or an earpiece with which to appreciate the work, is already something. And the other thing I find about it especially rewarding, which you alluded to by saying that there were very real constraints, is simply the idea that I think we often think about creativity in terms of making something out of nothing. And in fact, there's so much about creativity that's actually putting limits on something rather than something from nothing. It's in Pythagorean number theory, 1 is potential, it's the point, it's the possibility. 2 is very dynamic, but very unstable, and not really quite real. Yeah, I mean, if you have a table with 2 legs, you can't do much. But once you get to 3, you have something that's more fully manifest. And 3, in that way of looking at numbers and their symbolism, is actually a number of limitation. And the whole idea that limitation is how something comes into being, to me, is a fascinating one. Debussy said, I take all the notes and I leave out the ones I don't like. And so there's this notion of possibilities being left out are how we get identity. So Jane's production, in fact, I think the very limitations fuel the creativity of the production, in the sense that we don't have a lot of options.
Right.
We don't have a lot of the possibilities that we'd have with a fully staged version, which creates this possibility of a kind of creativity that's very focused and very, very powerful for its very limitations.
I mean, I compare it, Bertolt Brecht said opera was a culinary art form. And for me, that's taking all these incredible ingredients, and when it rarely happens, it's fantastic. Because I've been doing opera a long time now. And even if you revive a work and change one singer, the dynamic can change and everybody comes out going, ugh, that was a little flat, like a bad souffle. So for me, I make the comparison in a culinary form like coffee. When you're producing for an opera company, you make a cappuccino because you're given all this froth and lighting and costumes and dry ice and smoke and fabulous stuff. Whereas with a symphony orchestra, you're making an espresso. You're distilling it to the utmost essence to hand to the audience and say, smell and drink that.
And of course, I love coffee, and I like espresso, and I like cappuccino. And going back to what Maestro was talking about as far as, the different elements that this allows the piece to bring out. You focus on the orchestra, and it gives you an opportunity to hear the piece in a way that if you're watching a production, a fully staged production, of course, I'm all about creating the fantasy on the stage and creating it in a way that's different, that will engage the audience visually Here they're stressing the oral, but with the basic stage direction or direction that James will bring to this, he will be able to bring certain drama out, and in very much in a kabuki kind of way, will be able to stress elements of the staging that maybe would get lost in a larger production. And of course, from the point of view of opera, I'm very interested when an orchestra produces opera, or next week the ballet's producing Magic Flute, and later in the year I'm producing Magic Flute at the Cobb Energy Center. But it just builds awareness of the art form, and this is a great way for all of us to continue to collaborate together to keep all of our art form in front of the public on a longer period of time, as opposed to my only 4 productions a year. But with the symphony producing this work, and of course last year was it the Lion? Was it the Wild Things?
But that was 2 seasons ago.
2 seasons ago.
With Oliver, yeah.
And so consequently, it's a great way to bring out certain theater and musical aspects in a way that you would not have in a regular stage production.
I do want to ask you, Robert, about a couple of logistical aspects in doing this theater of a concert, because if someone were to come out to see you conduct The Ring in Seattle, they would see you in the orchestra pit, and then you looking over the orchestra to the singers on stage. What they will see this coming Thursday and in past theater of a concert experiences is different logistically. The orchestra is on stage with you, as you mentioned, and quite often the singers will be behind you, to a great degree out of your view. What kinds of considerations does that create for you as a conductor?
I think the scariest version of that was when we did Bohème, because they were really completely behind me, and I really had very little. They had monitors, and that was a help, so they could relate to me on the monitor, but I had very little direct visual contact with them myself, and it's just a way for me to feel connected often, is to look at the person I'm performing with. And so it was a strange feeling and a little bit scary to really try and find the synchronous music making that we were looking to do. That can be quite challenging. Or we often put ourselves spatially in conditions. We'll do it in this opera because I can say
Fisherman.
that, can't I?
Yeah, you can say.
The Nightingale's going to sing first from the balcony. So that'll present its own challenge too, just in terms of being together because of distance, which creates its own inherent problems. So those kinds of challenges are often real. And I think in this case, though, because we have the Atomic, we're using a version of the kind of stage we built for Dr. Atomic. So it's behind the orchestra and above.
So your set will be behind the orchestra for this, rather than the singers being out front.
Most of the time I'll have that more standard relationship to the singers.
But going back to what Robert was talking about as far as what some orchestras doing, and even opera companies, because I did this when I was in Milwaukee, if the singers are out front and the conductor's behind, a lot of times they'll put the monitors out there. The conductor has a monitor. They even have a television monitor so they can see the singer, and then the singers will see monitors across the front of the orchestra pit. Usually the orchestra is shoved all the way back, and then all the action takes place on the orchestra pit. And that will work, but it takes a little bit of getting used to that the conductor can trust the singers and the singers can trust the conductor. But after a while, it's just like anything. If you try it a couple of times, their ears adjust very quickly, and it seems to work out nicely. But I think the way you're doing it this way with the singers back up on the platform, that's a great idea. They can also use projections and use different things that can create a theatrical effect that the audience will also help to identify what's going on.
And it's my job to make sure those tricky score moments when they need to have eye contact with him, that they get it.
Right.
Because there's a lot of stage directors, some of my colleagues, don't read music and they don't care.
Yeah.
When she's doing the twiddly bit, just have her do something funny, James. Go do it.
Right.
When I trained under some very eminent directors, and they're not interested in...
There's a wonderful story, and I can't remember, and I'm glad I can't remember the exact name of the British director. But it was his first operatic experience, and it was in the dress rehearsal, which is meant to run like a performance. And at that point, it's usually, if anyone's going to stop the process, it's the conductor. But he was way back in the house, and there was some small detail on stage he wanted fixed, and he couldn't get the guy's attention. And finally, he's walking down, ready to walk up on stage, and he stops by the pit and shouts down into the pit, "Stop that dreadful noise!" So it is true that some operatic directors don't have as much sensitivity to
And you're
music as
limited on
others.
this as well, because you probably don't have monitors, and they all have to be in...
We tend not to.
Right.
Monitors are television
Television
pictures
monitors.
of the conductor. So in the middle of the orchestra, there will be a little camera picking up an image of Robert, and the singers are used to that. Because
So-
if they're on a stage, they normally have them on the side and even right out in the middle of the auditorium.
So when-
Dancers also have
So
that.
when you that already come to the opera of Cobb Energy Center, and you that will come, you want to look up in the corners and see the television monitors when you come to see Orfeo, I Eat Our Magic Flute. How's that for a little commercial?
There you go.
Good plug. And one of the great synchronicities with Robert and I is that, I think when I came to do Bernstein and Broadway, we hadn't worked together for almost 10 years. And we were in the middle of a rehearsal, and he was conducting away. I was behind him with the singers, and he just looked over like this, and I said, I'll fix it. And I knew what he was going to say. He needed eye contact, you know. And so that's great when a team really collaborates well together, and both of us know the score, and we know when singers have to be in connection to the conductor.
Yeah, that's always a clear communication.
Yes.
And let me just say about eye contact. I spoke to some young singers today that drove up from Tulsa to see the production, and singer, the teacher is someone I've hired many times, and we were talking about eye contact, that when you're conducting opera, you're conducting the orchestra, you don't have time to cue, and a lot of times it's the eyebrows. That's your cue to start singing. And it's all about the eyes. And every time a concertmaster comes and asks the maestro, what can I pass on to them? He or she always says, tell them to watch my eyes, watch my eyes. Because they're out here conducting and doing all this other stuff, and they can't cue everyone. It's all in the eyes.
Yeah.
I wanted to talk a little bit about the difference in time frame in putting together a fully staged operatic production as opposed to the amount of time that will be spent putting together the production we'll see starting Thursday evening
Right.
at Symphony Hall. You were directing Marriage of Figaro in Cincinnati this summer.
Right.
And now you're directing Stravinsky's Nightingale. Time frames for putting
Time
both together.
frames very different. Figaro, 3.5 hours of gorgeous Mozart, half of which is recitative. And I was working with Sir Roger Norrington, and I did my usual. I came in and set Act 1, Day 1. Act 2, Day 2. 4 days after we'd finished the opera, and I said, I'll see you on opening night. And everyone said, no, you've got 3 more weeks to go. And I was like, oh, God. Here, I think we did La Boheme in 5 hours.
Oh, my God.
Dr. Atomic in 5 hours. And then 2 hours with the chorus in the evening to do all their semaphore and sort of cranky movement stuff. This is 45 minutes long. I think in the Opera House you would probably get 2 or 3 weeks.
If I were staging this production, I'd probably spend a week and a half. The opera that we just finished, it was 2.5 weeks in the studio,
Right.
5 days on stage, and then we opened.
And in Europe, the last time I did Figaro in Europe, we had 7 weeks. That's a vacation.
We can't afford to go 7 weeks.
No, that's a long time.
Well, Robert, when you conducted The Ring in Seattle, how far in advance of opening night did you go out to begin preparations?
We opened the show the second week of August, and I had started rehearsing mid-May.
The rehearsal schedule for that, because the stage director sent me the rehearsal schedule, were 100 pages long. That rehearsal schedule was
And
100 pages long.
we start rehearsals when for the Nightingale?
We start tomorrow at, Robert has the singers for an hour at 1 o'clock till 2, and then he will give me the singers to work with, and he will be with me, and we'll rehearse from 2 till 6. But, we'll get through that very quickly, and then we'll work with the chorus in the evening for, I think they're scheduled 2 or 3 hours, but they sing all of 11 minutes or something.
But
so.
you may ask why. Well, first of all, they're not dealing with costumes, they're not dealing with makeup, they're not dealing with props, they're not dealing with...
Motivation, darling.
And this is all about singing and what's happening here, and minimal, type staging. I'm assuming...
And singers do ask for their motivation. I love Tyrone Guthrie, the eminent director, when a singer asked him, what's my motivation for doing this? And he said, pay packet on Friday, darlings. And ultimately that is the motivation, of course. But, singers do want to talk about their characterization. We're post-Freudian. They want to talk about who they are, how they were. How was Tamino brought up? Where did he live? Where does he come from? Despina, what did she have for breakfast before she dipped her finger into the chocolate? With this, I don't think we're going to go too deep. There's certain strata of hierarchical society, and we'll look at that very simply. And that will be short rehearsal period for 2 concerts, basically. And what I tend to do with these theatres of concerts is I ask the singers to bring their own garb. The men, it's usually tuxedo or tails, and the women and I have a conversation about colour and strapless and whatever, you know, and we add props and things to denote character, perhaps hats. So it's something simple for you that it's not too difficult for you to be thinking, what the hell is this guy doing with this piece? It's not Eurotrash. Because I'm afraid I have a lot of colleagues like in Salzburg where everyone's wondering in so many layers what is going on. You know, the end of Don Giovanni with blonde models running around naked and snow falling. That's not what Da Ponte says. But I'm not saying we have to make museum theatre and copy the designs from Mozart's day, but let's interpret it sensibly and creatively basically tells the story. My job is to tell the story, and I think when you mess with an audience head, you're failing. That's my take, personal though it may be.
I agree.
Well, before we maybe dive specifically into the Nightingale, I wonder if there are any questions from any of our members of the audience about anything that we've discussed so far. Okay. Well then, but again, please feel free if you do have a question, we'll invite you to just come up to the microphone and ask it, and we'll be delighted to try to answer it for you. Probably now is a good time to talk about the story that you are staging, and then maybe we can talk also a little bit about the history of Stravinsky's creation of this piece, because it is not only unusual in terms of the time frame, but I think it impacts on the music that we will hear. So
it's a beautiful, simple story. Typical director, I spent ages trying to look for deep, meaningful, post-Freudian allegorical meaning, and it's a fairy tale based on the Hans Christian Andersen, of which there are several versions. But the bird is a male bird. The nightingale is the male bird sings the most, right into the night. And the nightingale is known, it's interesting, I was saying to Ken, it's the three people who speak the most sense and have the most and the deepest connection to art are the cook, the fisherman, and the nightingale itself. So it's an animal. Whereas the courtiers, sycophantic courtiers, and the emperor, who has, it's hinted at, he's got quite a barbaric past,
right,
have no connection to art. And, but they understand the emotion that good art, i.e. good singing from a beautiful bird, will encompass. So basically, the cook is asked to go find the nightingale, to bring it back to the court, to the emperor. She locates it after lots of hilarious buffoonery from the court, thinking, what's that noise? It's a cow. What's that? It's a frog. They don't even know what a nightingale sounds like. And these courtiers for me are precursors to Ping, Pang and Pong from the Puccini. So to me, when I heard this score and read it, I thought, this is ridiculous. These people are funny. But I've never seen it played that way. I've always seen it played very seriously and very pompously. So the bird comes back, is brought back in, and delights everybody, and brings the emperor to tears, moves everybody very deeply. And the reward is for the bird is to see the emperor's tears. Two Japanese envoys arrive and bring a mechanical bird. And my head went straight to, you know, commercialism, materialism, but the emperor likes it better. And while he's discoursing this, the real nightingale flies away, chided in a little bit of a huff. And the emperor falls sick. We were kind of shticking that maybe swine flu, but he falls sick, and death arrives.
Bird flu.
Bird flu. Excellent, bird flu. And just in time for Thanksgiving. And death arrives. There's the allegorical figure. Death arrives with the chorus representing the spectral past. It's a little bit like the figures who come to haunt Boris in the last act of Boris Godunov by Mussorgsky. And the nightingale arrives and actually persuades Death to give up the emperor back to life. And Death enjoys the music as well. And it finishes very simply and very abruptly by everyone coming in a solemn cortege to bury the emperor, thinking he's dead. And he suddenly jumps up from his deathbed and says, "You're welcome here." And the narrator, the fisherman, comes back and discourses once more the beauty of song and art and artifice. That's simple.
Yeah. Thank you, that's beautiful.
You're welcome.
This is a piece that Stravinsky began writing while he was still working with Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov in the first decade of the 20th century, Rimsky-Korsakov died and Stravinsky put the work aside to mourn. Then he started working on it again, and he got a call from a man by the name of Sergei Diaghilev, who said, you know, I have this other composer who was supposed to write a ballet, The Firebird, for me, but he's not going to get it in on time. How would you feel about composing a Firebird? And Stravinsky felt trepidation because he didn't know he could get it done. Also, he didn't want to put aside the Nightingale for a second time, but he did. And of course, The Firebird was a tremendous success, followed by Petrushka, followed by The Rite of Spring.
You don't have the beginning of the Firebird, do you?
I actually believe that I do. Actually, no, I do not have the beginning of The Firebird, but we do have the lullaby from...
Many of you probably know the Firebird of Stravinsky. If you can, could we play the beginning of the Nightingale?
Absolutely,
Because
that's track 2.
It's very interesting that if you think about the beginning of the Firebird, which is the bass is doing has a very similar quality to the beginning of the Nightingale.
Yes.
I just thought of that, Ken, while you were making the link there.
I agree.
I thought of it too because of your mentioning Rimsky-Korsakov in this context is so critical in a sense because we often think of Stravinsky as the revolutionary and the iconoclast, and in fact, a wonderful study was done by Richard Taruskin called The Russian Stravinsky. If you ever want to investigate that 2-volume set, it's fascinating. And he shows what Stravinsky had learned from Rimsky-Korsakov with musical examples that are so explicit that it's darn near theft.
Right.
I can't remember who said it of whom, Stravinsky about Britain or Britain about Bernstein or Bernstein about Stravinsky, but that's not a composer, that's a kleptomaniac. and the influence of Rimsky-Korsakov on Stravinsky's early music in particular is really quite profound. And all of the things that we might associate with Stravinsky, not knowing so much of Rimsky-Korsakov's output other than Scheherazade, can be found in his operas. Because Rimsky was a prolific operatic composer. And in fact, a lot of those musical language things that we identify with Stravinsky come from Rimsky-Korsakov. The reason I find that to be so important is in this opera, because of the, well, I hadn't let you finish the timeline of it, but because of the way he came back to it, left it, came back to it again, the 3 acts reflect very different phases in his early development as a composer. So the first act shows more influence of Rimsky-Korsakov than the next 2. In fact.
Right.
And then the Act 2 and Act 3 eventually was developed into a ballet, as I understand.
Well, the Song of the Nightingale, the orchestral work,
Was
yeah,
the
and I
was
guess
the
that's
ballet.
been staged as a ballet
Yeah,
as well.
right.
Yes.
Right.
But the Act 1 was completed, and then we have the great trilogy of ballets for Diaghilev, The Firebird, Petrushka, and The Rite of Spring. And by the way, we'll be performing all 3 of those ballet scores during the course of our 2009-2010 season. So it's a wonderful chance for you to sample Stravinsky's development. And The Rite of Spring, of course, was the ballet that premiered in 1913 and was such a scandal that there were actually fistfights in the audience with members duking it out over whether they liked the piece, didn't like the piece, liked the staging, didn't like the staging. And it was at that point that Stravinsky returned
Let's have
to the
some of
Nightingale.
that. Let's have some of that on Thursday night, you know.
There you go.
That would be fun.
But you would think, I would imagine as an interpreter, for both of you, as interpreters of this work, is it problematic to deal with a score that was composed in two very different periods of Stravinsky's compositional life?
I think that I do not find it so. I find that development to be more organic and kind of evolutionary than what happens by the time we get to neoclassical Stravinsky.
Right.
So despite the fact there is a noticeable development and change, I find it to be rather still within its development within a certain kind of aesthetic without a radical shift of it. I mean, of course, the Firebird has many things to distinguish it from the Rite of Spring, and similarly Act 1 from Act 3, but on the other hand, you can tell it's all coming from the same composer. I don't know that that's true by the time you get to the Requiem Canticles of Stravinsky, that you can tell it's the same composer.
Right.
Because he does ultimately evolve so much more. But I find there to be a common thread there in that music that doesn't present that to be problematic for me. Musically, one of the things I find perhaps even more fascinating is the chinoiserie that goes on, because even though it's Hans Christian Andersen, this is a Chinese court, and Stravinsky engages in writing his imagination of Chinese music. And in fact, there are elements in the score that do come from traditional Chinese court music. So he knew something, and he had a lifelong fascination with things Asian because of the later pieces on haiku and Japanese music fascinated him. But already here he's doing a quite remarkable thing of distilling these elements of Chinese music, largely the pentatonic scale or the things we would identify with Chinese music, but filtering them through the prism of his musical imagination so profoundly that they're radically altered and transformed in that way that almost a Picasso-like mentality of taking something and radically transforming it in the process of using it. And yet it's recognizable. You can hear the Orientalism going on. And that's another study that I would recommend if anyone's so interested, of Edward Said, a book called Orientalism, that addresses this kind of aesthetic which was prevalent through much of European history as a way of incorporating the exotic into the aesthetic. It's certainly true already of a piece like Scheherazade from Rimsky-Korsakov, or what's the Sultan, what's that opera? I'm forgetting.
The Tsar Sultan.
Yes, yeah, exactly. That too has that mentality or aesthetic of exoticism, and that's certainly what Stravinsky's engaging here.
Where would opera history be without that Orientalism?
Well, and as you're
Abduction from the Seraglio has
you're
that
watching,
quality.
if you think back, Ping Pang and Pong and Turandot of Act 1, very much the pentatonic scale. You have that in the Ping Pang and Pong from the Turandot. And going back to, I don't want to put James on the spot, but when you start thinking about, the influence of the Rite of Spring and the Firebird, and was the John Dexter Hockney production in 1984, I believe, the Metropolitan Opera, it was the Nightingale, was the Rite of Spring, and then Oedipus Rex. And just that connection and the influence that he had as far as from the various periods of his time, and how opera companies have then strung those together as far as producing the various productions that just bring that same thread. And it's interesting to listen to Robert as far as the influence from an orchestral conductor, and then how we think about it from producing productions, and how we continue that thread in just the one acts that's strung together. In Canada, they're going to be doing it next month, the Robert Lepage, and they've strung together various small pieces that Stravinsky has written, something about a cat, fish, and a dog, and that sort of thing, along with the Nightingale. So it's just interesting how people have strung those different elements together.
And going back to your original question of, because of the disparity of when he wrote it in the breakup, what's the common link? For me, it's the fisherman. And we touched on this, and Robert made a very interesting point for me, because we talked about different interpretations, and he comes on and he basically has the same tune. And I thought it didn't make sense, but Robert made sense of it for me by saying he has to do it differently at the end, because this is post-learning. This is after the emperor supposedly died. What have we learned? What has changed? Because if we haven't learned anything, what are we doing? And I thought that made a lot of sense to me. So you, I believe, are going to take the tempo of the Fisherman's epilogue very differently. Yeah.
It's interesting, too, that in this story, music is a power such that it can even defeat death.
Correct.
Which is
Yeah.
kind of a remarkable thing about the fable itself. That would certainly make it attractive to a musician.
Yes, we should work on that more.
Sort of musical answer to Dorian Gray.
Yeah, right.
Well, maybe we should listen to a little bit of the music for the Fisherman and for the Nightingale, because we talked about the stylistic differences, but as you mentioned, the Fisherman and to a degree the Nightingale act as anchors or leitmotifs that give us continuity, even as perhaps some of his other compositional approaches are changing.
Ken, do you remember, do you have the Nightingale from Act 1 and also from Act 3?
I'm afraid that I only have the Nightingale song from the first act.
Okay.
So maybe we can play a minute of the Fisherman's song, and then we'll switch up. Let's first play a little bit of track 3. I've never read specifically anything about this, but I have to imagine Stravinsky really must have loved the tenor voice, thinking about this music and the music he wrote for Tom Rakewell in The Rake's Progress,
yeah.
to name just a couple of compositions. It's such beautiful vocal writing. It's so lyrical, and it's so expressive, too, I think, very haunting. Now we have the Nightingale, who is a coloratura soprano, and that's track 4. Let's listen to a little of the Nightingale's Act 1 song. That's just a bit of the Nightingale's Act 1 song, and she'll be singing that from in the audience?
Hopefully the balcony, somewhere up there.
That's wonderful.
And then she flies in, right?
And then we have her flying in at great expense. Yes.
Good. Let me check to see if we have any questions from our audience members. Yes, can I impose on you to ask the question up at the microphone? Or would you prefer that I just repeat questions depending on logistics? Okay, I agree with you.
Obviously, I don't sing. I just was curious as to who chose this to be performed and why.
This program came about at because of an invitation from Carnegie Hall, who asked us to participate in their Chinese festival that they're having this fall. And initially, we were going to do Nixon in China. That was programmed, and after we made those plans, the Met invited John to have Nixon in China at the Metropolitan Opera either this season or next season,
yeah.
and forbade him to have any other performances in New York until they did it at the Met. So we couldn't do Nixon in China as part of the Chinese festival at Carnegie, so we went in search of another program, and Carnegie actually said, would you do this commission? Carnegie's commissioning the Concerto for Yo-Yo from Angel Lam, who is a young Chinese-American composer. I think she divides her time between Hong Kong and LA.
That's right.
And Carnegie is commissioning that concerto for Yo-Yo and for us, and we were very excited that they wanted us to be involved in that particular project. And we thought of the Stravinsky Nightingale as a wonderful companion to it, fitting in with their Chinese festival, being the subject matter that it is. So it was really a matter of finding the companion for the concerto that started us in finding the Stravinsky. When we take it to Carnegie, the stage is smaller, and we won't have the flexibility to do this kind of production of the Stravinsky. We'll do it more strictly as a concert performance. We also take it to Athens,
Right.
Georgia, where we will also do it as a more simple concert presentation.
Have you conducted this opera before, Robert?
No, this is new for me and a wonderful
Yeah.
addition in my musical world.
It's a wonderful score, and you'd think that given Stravinsky's notoriety, that it would be performed more often than it has, but performances of the Nightingale are relatively rare in operatic repertoire, I would say.
I think there's a number of things that are prohibitive. One is the cast is not small, but nobody has to sing much.
Right.
And so it's a funny kind of challenge in that you have to have all these different people, but there's no real star among them, per se.
But vocally, you have to have luxury casting.
It's not easy,
Yeah,
right.
even if it's not a lot.
Right.
And it's also short, 45 minutes.
Right.
So it's hardly an evening. So you have to
You have
figure
to
out,
pair it up
as
with
they
another-
did,
right.
it was Toronto, right?
It's
that you
Toronto,
mentioned?
yeah. What's very interesting is that, I mean, within a month, you can hear the Atlanta Symphony perform this in a concert staging of the Nightingale, and if you care to, and when I was preparing for this, I really got excited about the staging of the Nightingale in Toronto. So at the end of the month, I'm flying to Toronto to see the Robert Lepage production, which is, Robert Lepage is mounting the Met production of The Ring Cycle in 2010, and if you've seen in the high definition movie theaters of The Damnation of the Faust, he's the director for that. Cirque du Soleil, they have water in the orchestra pit. I'd like to talk to my orchestra about that. But the orchestra is on stage. That's interesting. It's interesting how opera companies and orchestras are looking at opera and trying new things. For instance, this production in Toronto, the orchestra is going to be on stage, and the one piece that's about the cat, the clarinet's playing the cat, and plus then they're using puppets, and you have the singer and you have the puppets. And so you see all three modes of communication: the orchestra, the oral, the visual, and then the magic of the set. And that's an interesting way, and Toronto's just a buzz about this production, and so it's very hard to get a ticket. If you want to get a ticket, give me a call and I'll see what I can do for you.
Dennis, what's your view as a director of a major opera company about these kinds of efforts to reach out to younger audiences, new audiences? How do you think it's succeeding?
I think how is it succeeding? Let me first answer, what do we need to do? We need to be reaching out to new audiences. We need to be exploring new ways to present our art form. I know that talking to Robert as far as how they're presenting this, you're using stand lights and creating, some lighting on stage. We are exploring new ways of producing opera here in Atlanta. One of the things I'm very interested in exploring is video. If you can crack that expense to be able to produce opera with video, you see that all the time in trade shows. You see it in, large opera companies. It's very expensive but that it's a great stimulation for audiences, and they want to come in and they see those types of productions. It's important that we come up with ways as far as creative directing, using creative directors with lighting and special effects. James is doing a lot of that in other parts of the country. We're constantly looking for that sort of thing. In the past, we've used puppets, the Hansel and Gretel that we produced 2 years ago, Basil Twist. That was a great way to bring in new audiences. Our production, The Magic Flute, will also use puppets. And new techniques is something different for the audience, and you want to bring in different elements of your community. It allows you to build bridges to those areas, and then our goal is to make friends, and hopefully they come back and continue to support us.
Thank you. Well, should we listen maybe to a little bit of Rite of Spring and the last act of the Nightingale, because I think that makes for an interesting juxtaposition. This is a piece that you'll be conducting, Robert, in January, along with Osvaldo Golihov's Youth Without Youth Suite. The Rite of Spring, which again is the infamous ballet that premiered in Paris in 1913. Let's listen to the last section of the Rite of Spring, and this is track number 6. Fade that down. Now what we're going to listen to is the orchestral introduction to the last part of Stravinsky's The Nightingale, the work that Robert and the orchestra will be performing this Thursday and Friday. And this is the orchestral music setting the stage for the scene where the emperor is lying on his deathbed. So this is track 7. That sounds to me like a composer who has composed The Rite of Spring and feels pretty comfortable with what he did the first time around. And again, that portion of The Nightingale was composed after the conclusion of The Rite of Spring in 1913. That was about 1914 that Stravinsky finished the composition of the piece that you'll be hearing this Thursday and Friday. Any questions? Yes, please.
First of all, thank you so much for tonight. This is wonderful, and I hope everybody that's here will bring somebody else to the next one, because this is a great series. But
Thank you.
I want to get a little bit better idea of visual music and listening-only music.
Okay.
When I go to the symphony, I experiment, and I'm watching, and I like to watch different instruments. I like to watch you, of course, or any conductor, and then I'll close my eyes. And I don't mean listening on the radio or listening while you're driving or something like that. I mean just plain listening. And I wonder whether there's a certain type of music that is better experienced with just listening as opposed to also visually listening.
I had a very interesting reaction to, my first reaction to your comment is actually that any great music needs no other element than one's participation as a listener. And the listening is exactly what that musical experience is about. But in terms of how we appreciate a listening experience with a visual element, I was able to attend Donald Runnickel's performance of Brahms' Third Symphony and of the Goretzky Third Symphony. And there were visual elements to both the Brahms Third Symphony and to the Goretzky, and my friend Ann Patterson had been involved in creating these for that concert. And I've worked with Ann a great deal, and I love Ann, so I was able to go to her and say, I hated the Brahms, and know that she wouldn't get upset with me. And I realized, and it wasn't because I didn't like what she had done, it was that I didn't feel it worked, and I was trying to figure out why, because I thought the Goretzky did work very well. And what occurred to me was that the emotional content in the Brahms Symphony changes so quickly. The musical materials, the narrative of the musical materials is on a fast track, so that within a few seconds you can go from ecstasy to grief, to contemplation, to another kind of sadness, to a flash of joy. The emotional palette is unfolding at a really amazingly fast rate. And I'd never thought about that in that way until I saw it with the visual element. And then I realized the things that we've done where the visual element seems to be more successful are where the emotion, the affect, or the emotional tone of the music doesn't change very quickly. So that because what happens is if you try and have visual material have rapid rate of change while you're trying to listen to music, it's horrible. Because it's too distracting, it's too disturbing. So you need relatively static visual imagery to not interfere with the listening experience. We learned that the hard way here. And the Goretzky has that. The affect of the music doesn't seem to change very quickly. Or even in Bach, because that was the aesthetic of the day, was a movement of Bach essentially stays within an affect. You don't change the emotional content until you go to the next movement. And that was the aesthetic of the time. And so a visual element that is in concord with that emotional content of the music works.
So it's a harmony thing.
Exactly. And because then the visual elements don't have to change quickly. And I said to Ann that I was glad she hadn't tried to keep up with the Brahms. But then it also meant that the visual element was no longer corresponding to the content of the music. And if it had, it would have been a different problem. So that was just a thought I had in response to your comment.
I think it's a very interesting, it's a beautiful question because we live in an age of film and multi-sensory experiences. And to chime very much with Robert, one can put something to Bach. Jonathan Miller's done it because of the speed of the emotional delivery. But as a creative, when I listen to a piece of music, I always see images. It's very hard for me not to see images.
You see images every time?
Every time, whatever the piece of music is, something comes up for me. So if I'm asked to interpret something, quite often it's the original image that comes up. It may be a color, it may be an animal or a picture or someone moving. But I think your point on the speed is really, really important.
It's so interesting, too, because it's the flip side of what music provides for us in a film, which is primarily a visual experience, and we're watching the drama unfold, and the music is almost subliminally reinforcing our experience of the film.
Or telling us what to feel, in some cases, sadly.
But there's a difference, too, between my listening and watching a violin or a harp with the same music.
Right.
Yes.
Is that
That's
supposed
a
to
whole
happen?
different experience,
That's a different-
too.
yeah.
Yes.
But at the same time, I mean, Robert was talking about Brahms, and during that same period that music was written, you had a lot of nationalistic music being written, and the post-romantic where programmatic or symphonic tone poems are beginning to be written. You could put images along with the music, and I've seen people do that, and it's been very effective, but not necessarily all the time will it work. And I think a lot of the composers that wrote more abstract, meaning as far as there wasn't a story behind the music.
The other interesting challenge about
Brahms
visual
1 might
imagery
work.
is that, as James said, he sees things.
I know. I don't see things every time. It's interesting.
If we're showing things, it doesn't afford someone the opportunity to see what they're seeing in their own mind's eye,
Right.
which is another issue about visual elements. So it's always an interesting situation when you're adding the visual element to a primarily listening experience.
But it is a challenge in this day and age. Last week I judged the Atlanta Music Chamber players, and the composer in residence a couple years ago,
Michael Gandolfi.
Michael Gandolfi played a piece, and he had visual images with the chamber piece that was played that afternoon, and it was fascinating as far as the audience's response to just sitting there. So you have to figure out whether or not it works for your piece or not, and go with it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Dennis would be disappointed if I didn't have a question for him.
You're not, all right, or go for it.
I'll give you the sort of the line of free association that leads to the question. It may help. You use the culinary analogy. And of course, the moment you use the culinary analogy, we were thinking of the performer the other night in the Alliance Theater who was chewing up the scenery, that tall African woman who literally chewed up the scenery. Did you see the show?
No, I haven't seen it.
Absolutely, she was chewing up the scenery. So that sort of led me to thinking, those of you who are old enough will remember, 20, 30 years ago, there was a group, the first drama quartet, that did theater on the stage just with 3 or 4 music stands, and it was quite a fad for a while. Didn't last a long time, because I think, and I could be wrong, because there wasn't enough interplay, not enough theatrical interplay between the people. It leads me in a long way to my question. And that is, if you're going to do things on the stage, you're going to do opera on the stage, and this may be for Dennis, where you don't have the kind of interplay that the theater of opera requires, how do you choose, or do you have to choose carefully so that you can get things that don't suffer by being reduced to something that doesn't have that kind of interplay?
So when we do theater of a concert, do we have to look for specific repertoire?
Can you find the kind of repertoire where you don't diminish the work by taking
thinking
out
back what we've done.
the staging, the production, the interplay?
I mean, thinking back what we've done, it's a pretty broad spectrum, I think, of operatic material. Bohème, Dr. Atomic, and
That's why I
Stravinsky's
asked
The
the question.
Nightingale.
You've picked some
It would be
stuff
hard
I
to
wouldn't
find a
expect.
commonality, I would think, about them from a theater of a concert perspective.
No, I can't find one immediately.
No, I think what you have to think about if you're doing something in concert form, we were talking about different elements, that if you're listening to a concert staged version or watching a concert staged version of an opera, it really puts the focal point on the music. And Robert really needs to bring all the drama out in the orchestra and all the drama for the singing. When you listen to recordings of Nilsson, I've got a recording that I just love of her singing Electra. I don't need a set. I do not need costumes. I don't need to see the person. I feel the whole action. So musically, it puts different pressures on a production when it's done in a concert form. You have to bring out all the drama
I
in
agree.
that musical experience. You got to feel it inside, otherwise it's...
That takes me back to distilling it. And
Right.
when Robert invites me to do such works, for me it's what can I do to enhance that experience rather than detract from it? Because one can see it in film. One can see something happening and the music underneath is at a different
enhances it.
layer. It either may enhance it or it may be contra what's happening to make you deliberately think of something else. And although I may have sounded earlier as if I was disparaging some of my colleagues, some of them that's what they want to do. They want to give you another layer to think of. What is happening here with snow and naked women and Don Giovanni not going to flames, which is what Da Ponte says, or that he's left in limbo and he doesn't go to hell. Mozart and Da Ponte said he goes to hell. There's the lesson. So it's great art is open to interpretation. And the privilege of being invited to do something like that is to interpret it. Simply interpret it. My interpretation. You may not buy into it. I remember some fantastic members of your audience last year coming up and saying wonderfully eloquent and very gracious things to me after Atomic, but yet I heard someone leave the hall saying, depressing but magnificent. And we looked at each other and said, exactly.
And that's okay.
And that is okay.
But everything gets magnified when it's a concert version. The orchestra's magnified, and a singer just moving their hand, that means something. So every little movement on stage suddenly is looked upon, and minimalistic becomes huge at that point. If you ever seen the Robert Wilson staging of things like Lohengrin or any of his productions. It's very slow. Some people hate it. I think it's fantastic. I don't think I'd ever do it here in Atlanta, but it's a great show to see, but everything's very slow and everything is magnified.
You know, Robert, in thinking again when I said that it would be hard to find a commonality between those three productions, I think I knew I misspoke as soon as I misspoke. And by that I mean, if you look at the three operas, they're very different in terms of their creations, the artistic sensibility, but they're all extremely rich, both from an orchestral and from a vocal perspective. And in that sense, it would seem to me that they're ideal for this kind of theater of a concert where you have such close interaction between singers, orchestra, music director.
Well, I have to say my reaction to the question was simply, if the score is great, we don't have a problem.
Right.
If the music is great. If the musical score is great, then it will be fine in concert performance. I don't know that I'd want to do Norma
In a concert?
in a concert performance.
No.
No,
I've seen it. You don't want to do
I
it
love Bellini,
that
but
way.
not that much.
And you need a great, rich score if it's going to be a concert version. We just finished Donizetti's Elizir.
I wouldn't want to do that.
You wouldn't want to have that as a concert version. But on the other hand, you talk about let's perform Tristan, put the orchestra on stage. They're the star as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
They're the star.
And I think that is the commonality. The scores we have, the operas we have chosen to do this way are
The Bohem's a
magnificent
rich
scores.
Rich score.
We have time for another question, I think, before we break for the evening.
Ask us a hard question.
I just have a comment. I think we're just so fortunate to have the four here. I travel all over the world, and the Atlanta Opera and its chorus are known as one of the best in the world. And
Thank you.
I was in Paris watching Nabucco, and the man next to me was the art critic for Figaro, and he said, I said, what's wrong with this chorus? And he said, oh, they're pretty good. I said, no, I live in Atlanta. He went, oh, you have the best. So
Thank you.
how fortunate are we to meet the makers? I appreciate your presence so much.
Well, thank
Thank
you
you.
so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I just want to add, we have, I think, the world's greatest orchestra chorus here in the Atlanta Symphony. You have the greatest chorus.
Well, I want to take a moment to thank all of you for spending your Sunday evening with us. I think it was a delightful and ideal way to spend the Sunday evening, particularly with the build-up to our performances this week of Stravinsky's The Nightingale, Thursday and Friday with Robert Spano, and the members of the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra Chamber Chorus. James Alexander will be our stage director for this Theater of a Concert production. So I want to thank James and Robert Spano and Dennis Hanthorn for spending their evening with us and giving us such a wonderful insight into this magnificent piece of music. If you haven't purchased your tickets already for the concerts this week, I believe the concerts are sold out, but please keep checking for ticket availability. It's going to be a great, great week, and we hope that you will be part of it as you were this evening. So thanks to all of you. Have a wonderful week. We look forward to seeing you this
Thank
week.
you,
at
Ken.
Symphony
Thank you.
Orchestra. Thank you.